No problem.
Where do you stand?
My name is Michael Sandell. I teach in the government department here at Harvard, and I'm the moderator for tonight's discussion. Thank you all for coming. Our topic tonight is sex, commercialism, and the disappearance of childhood. Here are some of the questions that we're going to discuss tonight among our panel, and we hope also from those of you who have joined us. Are Beavis and Butthead, Calvin Klein ads, and MTV raising America's children? And if so, what are the implications for the future of American democracy? And what are the civic resources available to combat the effects of the consumer society as promulgated by the media in shaping children's identities? This forum is part of a new initiative of Children's Studies at Harvard, an initiative that is going to try to document and discuss the changes in the culture of childhood and the role of children in public discourse. Children's Studies at Harvard, funded by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation, is just completing its first year of existence. Its aim is to encourage increased attention to children in Harvard's graduate and undergraduate programs, to foster interdisciplinary research on children, and to develop connections between Harvard and the greater Boston community to enhance children's learning and well-being. We would like to recognize Martha Minow of the Harvard Law School, and Stuart Hauser of the Judge Baker Children's Center, the guiding spirits of children's studies at Harvard. And we'd also like to thank Heather Campion of the Forum for all the arrangements that made possible this gathering tonight. Let me begin by introducing all three of our panelists. Kiko Adato is the new director of children's studies at Harvard, an award-winning teacher of American culture and politics in the Department of Sociology at Harvard for 7 years, then a faculty member and research fellow at the Kennedy School, and the recipient of a Markle Foundation grant. Her research on the ever-shrinking soundbite in television news and her acclaimed book, Picture Perfect, The Art and Artifice of Public Image Making, sparked a national debate on the trivialization of television news campaign coverage. Dr. Alvin Poussant is clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and director of the Media Center at Judge Baker Children's Center in Boston. Dr. Poussant is the author of Why Blacks Kill Blacks and the co-author of Raising Black Children, as well as the author of dozens of other articles. He was a script consultant to NBC's The Cosby Show and A Different Voice, and he continues to consult the media as an advocate for more responsible children's programming. And Bill Kovich, a newspaper journalist for 30 years, is curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. Mr. Kovich was the editor of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution from 1986 to 88, during which time the paper won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Prior to that, he had a distinguished career with the New York Times as an editor and reporter, and he is today a leading voice for ethics and excellence in the journalistic profession. So it's a great pleasure to welcome this distinguished panel, and let me turn things over to our first speaker, Kiko Adato.
The question I would like to pose is whether we are witnessing the disappearance of childhood. In one respect, the answer is obviously no. Children are at the top of our political agenda. Politicians are always talking about children. The baby boomer generation of parents are ushering their children from the soccer field to music lessons to computer classes. They're clearly a very child-centered generation. But if we look at our popular and consumer culture, we see that childhood is under siege. In television, movies, ads, and fashion magazines, there has been a hollowing out of the belief in the innocence and moral agency of children. We feel that our public space is crowded out with these consumer images, and that the boundaries that separate adulthood from childhood are eroding. The tale of our transformed view of childhood can be told in 2 pictures. The first is an 1845 daguerreotype of a young girl taken by the very famous Boston art photographers, studio artists Southworth and Haas.
Do we want to dim the lights, or can people see?
This daguerreotype expresses the triumph of the ideals of childhood innocence and education in the culture of mid-19th century America. It also realizes photography's ambition to capture the soul of the subject, the inner character and qualities and inner life of the person. 150 years later, things have changed. Calvin Klein's ad featuring the model Kate Moss is the polar opposite of the vision of mid-19th century childhood. It is as if the face of the girl in the daguerreotype and Kate Moss, which bear an eerie resemblance, have been transformed, and the girl of the daguerreotype has shed her innocence and her modest dress and assumed the soulless stare of Calvin Klein's model. In this ad, innocence is overlaid with eroticism, and together they form the dissonance that sells. The message is, if you like little girls, you'll love our perfume. How do we get from the daguerreotype to Calvin Klein? And what does it say about childhood in our culture? From the age of the daguerreotype through the 1950s, across the lines of class and race and region in America, there was essentially one view of childhood, that it was a special province of life, and it was celebrated as such. This portrait of the daguerreotype artists, not a daguerreotype artist, but the studio artist, now in the 1920s, when photography had advanced, was James Vandersea. And he was the great chronicler of the Harlem Renaissance. This photograph was probably taken in the late 20s or early 30s. His portrait of children have the same sensibility as the daguerreotype. It celebrates their beauty and their innocence and the love of the mother towards her children. This next slide, again a studio photograph, is taken by Richard Samuel Roberts in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, Columbia at that time was a segregated city, and in the directory, they had a separation between blacks and whites, and he was listed simply as a janitor. But actually, he ran a great photographic studio, and he chronicled the life of the entire black community in Columbia, South Carolina. And this is an example of one of the beautiful portraits he did of a child, and another, the Boy Scout. And what you see is in studio photography, this just celebration of daily life. This is the period before we had the snapshot and the kind of cameras we used to document this, and people went to a studio to have it done. The ideal of childhood innocence also pervaded documentary photography, where the subjects were poor and oppressed and outcasts. This is a photograph by Jacob Riis, a great progressive photographer and social reformer. And this was taken at the turn of the century. Again, impoverished, but you get this image of mother and child. The next photograph is taken by Louis Hine, another progressive photographer, of a mill girl. And he was advocating, obviously, against child labor and the oppression of children in factories. But the innocence and the individuality of this little girl is what makes that picture a real call for social reform. This same sensibility pervaded the photographers of the Depression. This is one of the most famous photographs during the Depression era, Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. And again, you see the selfhood of the mother, even the kids' faces are turned away, the family ennobled, and that the portrayals of the Depression-era documentary photographers was to not portray people simply as victims, but to show, in a sense, that they transcended their social circumstances because their individuality and their distinctiveness is highlighted. This is from a book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Again, one of the most famous photographers of the Depression era, Walker Evans. You see the pathos of poverty. But in another photograph, you also see this beautiful innocence and individuality of the child. And you almost feel that the child, even though he's in the most destitute of circumstances, with paper newspapers and in the shack, has this beauty that reminds you again of the daguerreotype in the studio photographers. And in this last Depression era image of a little girl churning butter, again, poor, whether they're in shacks, on the road, in dust bowls, but at the same time a sense of their agency. They make something of the world. They're changing the world. The sentimentalized and idealized portrait of childhood and the family came to its height in the mid-1950s in the Family of Man exhibit. And this was in 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art. And you know that book is still one of the most popular photography books ever published. And some of the photographs are rather sentimental and corny, like this one. And it reminds you of the television programs of the 1950s, Howdy Doody, Mickey Mouse Club, Leave It to Beaver, Donna Reed, Father Knows Best, this kind of picture-perfect family. Other photographs, though, in the Family of Man really, again, speak to this, the individuality, the innocence, the joy of motherhood, of childhood. And finally, this, again, very famous photograph by Eugene Smith, which culminated the Family of Man, and a culminating view of this picture of childhood innocence, of all the beliefs that had been held intact in our culture from the first photographic image in 1840 through 1955. But even as photographers were celebrating the innocence of children, and even as the 50s was filled with this idealized Leave It to Beaver, Donna Reed, Father Knows Best family, there was another view that was beginning to brew in the art world, not yet in the popular culture, but in the art world. And that was that childhood may not be so innocent. It was a darker vision of family life and of childhood. And the ideal of childhood as a special province of life was not assumed. This new generation of art photographers in the 50s and 60s depicted a social landscape in which the relationship between the self and society was askew. The individual is exposed, obscured, fragmented, and deformed. Childhood, and the images of the ideal childhood are punctured. This is a picture by William Klein, Mini Gang on Amsterdam Avenue, where the child's contorted face really looks like a grown-up thug. This is a photograph by Diane Arbus, famous photographer of the 60s and 70s. And here we have the idea of the breaking down of the boundary between the adult world and the child's world. This fragmentation of self would push just a little bit farther. And in her images, she portrays children and adults alike as freakish. She sought out freaks in deviants and circus performers, men with tattoos, but she also made the most ordinary things of daily life, babies and these twin children, look a little bit odd and freakish. This is not, for example, your Leave It to Beaver family. Diane Arbus went into suburbia and found this lovely family with the grown-up son who's a giant, dwarfing his parents. And she took, I think, 100 shots before she got just the right sense of freakishness and absurdity of the family image. And this last photograph, again, shows how she used the camera's lens to transform the ordinary into something freakish and distorted. You would think this child was maybe physically disabled or spasmodic, but he's just an ordinary, privileged, rich kid in Central Park. You can tell by his fancy clothing. And he's holding a little toy hand grenade. And again, she waits for that moment, how she gets him, took a lot of waiting, to make him look like a freak. Here in a later photograph by Joel Cohen, you see that the agency and innocence of the child is destroyed simply by cutting off the kid's head. You know, what's normally a childhood, spontaneous, fun activity of jumping rope becomes, here she is a person, if you say that you don't have agency, you're not a subject, well, if you lob off the head in the frame, you make the point as a photographer. In this photograph, taken again in the 50s, art photographer Gary Winogrand portrays a very bleak view of suburbia. This child, little baby, against this darkened garage, a very remote house against a very desolate landscape. Again, a very contrary view from the idealized portraits of suburbia. And finally, this image by the art photographer Gary Friedlander shows this isolation and desolation of childhood through this image of a child, almost an indecipherable image on a television screen in an empty motel room. And the face is ambiguous. It's almost a simulation of selfhood, a far cry from the spontaneous, naturalized, sweet portrayals that we saw up through the mid-50s. Now, the 60s, besides this trend of showing the breakdown of the boundary between childhood and adulthood in terms of saying, okay, children and adults are the same. They're freakish, they're fragmented, they're isolated, they're desolate, was another trend that has its first stirring in the 60s, and that is the merging of childhood innocence and adult eroticism. Now, in the 60s counterculture, this started off as an idea people celebrated, not the emerging, but the idea of childhood as something we all should be. Adults should discover the child from within. And this was a big tenet of the counterculture and popular self-help books. And people would go and deck their flowers in their hair and go to be-ins and love-ins, adults, to recapture the innocence and spontaneity of youth. The problem with that and the paradox of it is if adults are discovering the child within and acting in a sense, and just like children, or seeing their identity as discovering their childish nature, then there is a breakdown of the boundary that was held so constant for so long in our culture between adulthood and childhood, because adults were sexual beings, and there was also this acting out of new sexual liberation. And so the merging of the childlike quality that the adult was trying to discover and the sexual liberation produced this ironic merging of eroticism and innocence. In the fashion world, it created a big change. There were two trends, the youthquake in fashion photography, where anorexic girl-like models like Twiggy were featured in national magazines, and also a hard-edged eroticism not involving children that pervaded the fashion world, where mannequins and fashion models were dressed up in sadomasochistic and violent tableau. This came to full culmination by the 1990s in the ads of Calvin Klein. Now, these ads created an enormous controversy. Calvin Klein, this is an ad from his 1995 campaign where he's using very young teenagers as models. In the earlier ads, he used people and made them look young. For example, the Obsession ad I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. It's Kate Moss, but she's now over 20. These were kids really 15 and 16 years old. And it had gone too far. He had sort of pushed the envelope too far. And there was a huge public outcry. But this movement in Calvin Klein had been brewing since the 1980s. He used Brooke Shields in jeans ads and on huge billboards in Times Square, and on television commercials where she would say, "Do you know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing." And so you had then this development to this point in Calvin Klein, where you have TV commercials in which this is a still from one of the TV commercials, where there was an off-camera voice talking to the kids as if they're in a pornographic movie, kind of coaching them, asking them why they want to be there. That was interesting on this campaign. It wasn't the ads on TV or in the fashion magazines, according to people in the advertising world, that really got these ads yanked. It was that he took the images, particularly the first one, and put them on city buses. So parents would be waiting with their kids, going someplace, and all of a sudden looking at these ads, and there was a huge letter writing campaign. And so Klein decided that he was going to take out a full-paged ad in major newspapers to explain that the public had really misinterpreted the intention of his ads. And I'm quoting from the ad. "The message of the advertising campaign is that young people today have a real strength of character and independence. However, some people are taking a different perception of our ads. We have been taken aback by that perception because it differs so sharply from our intended message. Because of the role of the fashion industry plays in shaping the culture, we have a special responsibility to young people. We share the concerns some have raised about the challenges children have growing up today." We believe in the positive message of these ads about the spirit, independence, and inner worth of today's young people. Because we take our responsibility to young people so seriously, we will cease running the remainder of this ad campaign. So Calvin Klein reformed. He decided, okay, that's it. I'm not going to use young models. He came up with a better idea. Why not make images from the drug culture and child abuse? So heroin chic became the mode of the 90s. And these are the ads that have just finished running. Be hot, be cool, just be. The theme of childhood eroticism and abuse has been played out in an even more radical way in the world of art photography. One of the most prominent cutting-edge photographers, the art photographers, is Sally Mann. She rose to prominence with her exhibit and book, Immediate Family. In it, she takes pictures of her own 3 children. This one, Jessie at 5. Notice how her pose is not the natural pose of a child, but the contrived pose of a fashion model. The same is true of this picture of her son, Emmett. It could be from a Ralph Lauren ad. This picture, called Candy Cigarette, again shows her daughter, Jessie. But she is not engaged in the kind of goofing around play kids do with, putting on their mother's high-heeled shoes and purse and a candy cigarette. The languid look, the pose, the look is a pure act of cultural imitation. We've seen that look, that pose before in a whole series of movies, from Lauren Bacall to Sharon Stone to Madonna. Mann titles this photograph Dirty Jessie. Supposed to be a picture, she says, of just how her little child was playing in the leaves and kicking off her rubber boots and getting in the mud. But again, it's a pose worthy of a Calvin Klein ad. Similarly, in this photograph, Nap Time, we do not get a picture of childhood innocence, how sweet and pure and darling they look when they're taking a nap. But again, a series of provocative poses. Mann also posed her children in tableaus of abuse and victimization. Unlike the documentary photographers of the Depression or the Progressive era or the documentary photographers of today, she doesn't use her photographs as a call to reform. There's no profound social criticism because we know that each photograph is just a simulation of victimization and abuse. This photograph was her first one for Immediate Family. It was taken in 1984. Her daughter Jessie came in with some gnat bites, an eye swollen up. And she found this a golden opportunity to take a picture mimicking. It's named after a photograph taken in the Depression by Dorothea Lange and had the same title, Damaged Child. Similarly, her son's bloody nose becomes an occasion for a new pose, showing how passive and victimized the child looks. The victim, obviously, if you just looked at the photograph without a context, of child abuse. The next photograph is called Rodney Plugger at 6:01, and it's Sally Mann's 3-year-old daughter with someone from the neighborhood named Rodney Plugger. And again, the implication of abuse and incest. Hey Hook is the title of this photograph. Now, Mann, like Calvin Klein, when asked about her asked about her photographs by interviewers, denies that there's anything wrong with them. She, in her opening of Immediate Family, celebrates the innocence and spontaneity of childhood. And she said, I don't think of my children, and I don't think anyone else should think of my children with sexual thoughts. I think childhood sexuality is an oxymoron. I'd like to end with these photographs that again return us to the natural world of childhood innocence, of play, of spontaneity. This first one was taken by Helen Levitt in the 1950s. Two little boys playing in a lot. Kids playing with a fire hydrant. And this last image, a beautiful photograph again by Helen Levitt. And what you see in these photographs is not the photographer's manipulation of the child through the camera, posing them as adults, but standing apart from the child and letting them be children, letting them engage in spontaneous play. And to show how profoundly different that is than the culture of victimization and the play, both in Calvin Klein and Sally Mann, of this idea that your identity is determined by your victimization. We know in talk shows and in tabloids, the more victimized you say you are, the more you can go into the lurid details of it, the more you rise to fame and fortune these days. And that's true of childhood. But here, these are poor New York City kids, but they're creating a world of their own. And it reminds me of the contrast between, again, the literary references that we know in the 19th century. Think of Huckleberry Finn, for example. He was, if we were to cast him in today's term, as an abused child from a dysfunctional family. His dad was a drunk. He had no mother. You know, he lights out on the river. But that's not how we see him. We see him as a master, an agent of his destiny. He travels the rivers and roads, and he has a lot of fun doing it. Similarly with Jane Eyre, or Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, or the whole slew of orphan heroes of the 19th through the early 20th century. They were all agents and masters of their destiny. And this ideal, then, of childhood, we haven't lost it entirely in our culture. These feelings about childhood are still represented in our family photographs. Documentary photographers still work in the mode of Depression-era photographers, documenting the problems of poverty that children face, and yet ennobling the child and respecting their dignity. We have all kinds of resources in our family and civic life that resist these three trends I've talked about in the changing culture of childhood, that children have become eroticized and objectified, children have become portrayed as fragmented and dissonant selves, and children have become symbols of the culture of victimization. So we have that form of resistance in our civic life to combat the enormous inroads of our consumer and popular culture.
Thank you very much. You turn now to Dr. Alvin Poussin.
Yeah, you want to hold that commercial. Don't show it yet, because I think I want to follow up on some of the things that Kiku said. I think the loss of innocence, if we want to call it that, I mean, I think that the Calvin Klein ads are in part a reflection of a lot of things that have been going on in society for a long time. And that is what we are exposed to via TV, via the media, via the movies, that has dramatically changed, particularly in the area of sexuality. And what we can see, what we can hear, what we can watch, and that there's almost no control over the medium, that is TV, and screening out what children want to watch on a tube. And as you know, with each year that passes on television, they push the edge a little bit more with what they can say, the kind of words they can use, and you can see it progress over time. So children at a very early age are being exposed to all kinds of things on TV, unmonitored by their parents. 54% of children have their own TV set in their room in America. So they can watch anything they want, and they can watch anything they want on cable, again, without being monitored by parents. So the words they hear, what they come into contact with, they at age 5 and 6, they can talk to you about AIDS or anything else you want to talk about, from watching not just programs, but also because they listen to and watch the news when it's on in their homes. And they come home from school and they watch the talk shows. If you watch the talk talk shows, you treat it to just a stream of very sexualized images, particularly of children. Look down the list any given day, and they'll have programs like teenage promiscuity, how my teenage daughter stole my boyfriend from the mother, and so on, just over and over and over again. Some of it verging on, there was even one show, among many others, when they brought on a 12-year-old girl who they described as sexually promiscuous, who then had her describe her sexual behavior to the audience in the studio and, of course, on the airwaves. And this was presented on a talk show and presented as entertainment. And you can see her focusing in on teenagers and young people as sort of the bad people and the out-of-control people, and then this is pushed over and over again. So I think that what we see reflected in some of the ads and some of the photographs is just part of this general picture that young people are exposed to. I don't have any studies to back it up, but anecdotal reports from many people that children talk more and more about sexuality and engage in sexual play in schools. The school teachers complain about this quite a bit. We know that people are engaging in sex at a younger age. You see reports in the newspapers of boys as young as 8 years old molesting girls who are six years old. This has been appearing more and more in the press. So this is something that is really going on at a stepped-up rate, I think, in American society, and has been of some concern to psychiatrists, child psychiatrists, and to pediatricians for a long, long time, and they have issued many warnings over many years about this. In addition, I go to movies a lot to check them out, and that's a good excuse, isn't it? But I frequently see, and just last week I went to an R-rated movie, and there were parents in there with a young girl I estimated to be about 4 or 5 years old. I've gone to movies before, and I see parents in there, or adults, or whoever they are, with children 5, 6, 7 at R-rated movies, right? With graphic violence, graphic sexuality. Sometimes the children hide their faces when the sex scenes come up, or get frightened, or whatever. Sometimes when they see the violence, graphic violence, they even yell out a little bit or get scared in the theater. And the parents frequently may not take them out of the theater, even if they're afraid. We don't know what the follow-up effects of seeing these things are. I don't know of anyone who studied this phenomena of children being exposed to that kind of graphic sexuality and violence. Again, you hear anecdotal reports about children having nightmares, and probably some of you have had nightmares after seeing these films. So to bring a 6-year-old, 7-year-old child in there is quite a serious issue and problem. We don't know the after effects in terms of the stimulation that the sexuality may provide, how they integrate this, what do the parents talk to them, what's going on? We don't know, but we know that they are being exposed and overexposed sometimes by the very adults themselves. Now, an R-rated film, rated R, says no one under 17 admitted without an adult. Now, why would a parent think that if a film said no one under 17 can enter without an adult, that they would think it was suitable or there was no harm in letting a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old watch the film? Now, there's an issue here about the ratings that's very obvious. Now, a number of people have suggested, because of this abuse of the rating system in this way, that they just have a rule in R-rated films that no one under 13 or 12, we can debate this, can be admitted at all, whether brought in by an adult or not, that they should not be exposed to that type of graphic sexuality and violence that is nearly in all the R-rated films. Now, when this was proposed, Jack Valenti, who's the president of the American Motion Picture Association, and maybe, Bill, you can help me out with this, but he said to impose such a ruling would be a violation of the First Amendment rights. And I couldn't figure that out for the life of me. I still can't. Because if we don't let anyone under 18 at all go to an X-rated movie, right, you're supposed to be barred, then why is it a violation of First Amendment rights not to allow 13-year-olds to go to an R-rated movies? But this is his counterattack to any such proposals. He feels that it would be the beginning of censorship. I think in this case, putting a rating on a film is not censorship in that sense, because it's not restricting what they can produce, but it's warning parents and children that this is something that is not suitable for their viewership. And I think that's appropriate if we're thinking about protecting the well-being of children in our society. So we have two things to do here. We can fight about policy and about the rating system. You know that many PG-13 movies are also not suitable for young children, but young children are in those movies all the time, and even some PG movies. So we're kind of gotten out of balance on exactly what these things mean, and as the industry keeps pushing the edges, as I say, you see more and more graphic sexuality. I recently saw two movies that were R-rated, where the narrators of the movie were children. The narrators of the movie, with the graphic sexuality and so on, and the violence and so on, were children themselves, 12 and 10 years old. Two films that I recently have shown. So that, you know, the other thing that in terms of the R rating, and perhaps kidding ourselves, we know very well that most theaters managers don't enforce a rating system in the first place. In other words, if you're 12 or 13, it's rare that you're going to be turned away if you go in to buy a ticket for an R-rated movie, because they cut down on revenues. And probably some of you sitting out there probably have never heard of an instance where a young person was turned away from an R-rated movie that they wanted to see, and have all kinds of strategies for getting in to see them. So that I think there's a problem in enforcement and the seriousness about our concerns and the impact of this type of material on children. Let me just switch for a moment. I was going to, well, let me just a little emphasis. I brought this, I may as well show it. If you're talking about sexualization of children, the sad tragedy of Jean Benet Ramsey, right? Beauty pageant winner, 6 years old. Now, if you saw clips of her beauty pageant activities and the other young girls on television, it was highly sexualized. They pose and model just like the runway models or in the Miss America contest, and they're very sexualized, as this young girl is, with makeup as an adult. So that it's not, if children are being sexualized, or all of this new era of sexualized media, it's affecting adults as well, who in fact want their children at a very early age to be sexually appealing, particularly the young girls. And so there's an element in here of a lot of sexism and other things. By the time that we're very concerned about child abuse and sexual child abuse, the fact that this continues, and that the tabloids, this young girl's face has been on tabloids for the whole year, and frequently in very sexualized poses, looking as an adult. So that we are all guilty in some way in being drawn in to this sexualization of children and the loss of innocence and putting that type of burden on them. Also, finally, just a reminder that all the sex on TV and the movies doesn't come with any message about the risks, doesn't come with any message about the responsibilities, doesn't come with any messages about contraception. So we have the epidemic of AIDS and also other sexually transmitted diseases are actually increasing rapidly again in American society, and again affecting younger and younger people, so that now when the government agencies give their reports on sexually transmitted diseases, they start with the age 12. They say 12 to 50 or whatever, 12. Not 15, 16, 17, age 12. So that this is also a serious health issue for American society and the well-being of young people. Now I'll have the commercial. I'm going to do a switch from that topic into another one where there's concern about really boundaries being crossed and the impact of advertising and commercialization on children. Could I have that run of that?
Do you know what's best about getting dressed?
2, 3,
Put your arm in your shirt.
It won't even hurt. Oh, good.
Your dress goes over your head. We hope you heard what she said. And that's what's best about getting dressed. Put your jacket on right.
And zip it up tight.
Put your legs in your pants. You'll be doing that dance.
Come to Kmart for the whole line of Sesame Street clothes at Kmart's everyday low prices.
And that's what's best about getting dressed.
This is brought to you by the letter K
Hey!
for Kmart.
30 years on public television with public money produced by nonprofits, right? Public television to be free of commercial advertising to children because of for obvious kinds of reasons, exploitation and so on. But here now, in 1997, is a commercial using characters from Sesame Street, which I consider like almost a public property, being used for commercial advertisement. Think of some of the ethical issues here. They end the same way that many Sesame Street programs end, by saying D is for the letter dog, whatever. In this one, they say K is for Kmart, so that a child being bothered with those commercials, they hear the letter K, can think of Kmart, and presumably then will drag their parents there to buy them goodies and Sesame Street items and all the other objects in Kmart. And so to me, this is stepping over the boundaries in terms of what our responsibilities are. This is controlled by Children's Television Workshop. I don't know, and they need money, apparently, so they're licensing out some of these products to commercial outfits. I saw another one with Big Bird last week in an ad for Ford Windstar, right? And we're told the children that somehow fasten your seatbelt so this car was safe. Well, if they wanted to do a PSA on seatbelts or safety, they should do it for all cars, not for Ford Windstar. So obviously, there's a commercial arrangement between the people who control the licensing for these characters and the commercial world. And I think it's really something that's very, very scary if we allow it to go on. As you know, the question came up this past year about allowing commercial advertising on television. It's such a big subject, I can't spend a lot of time on it. But children are just bombarded with television ads all over again. Peggy Charon, who's sitting in the audience right over there next to Martha Minow, in fact, fought for many, many years to get the amount of advertising on children's television shows reduced to the minimum that you get, and it was reduced both on weekdays and on weekends. But there's still a great deal of it, and children frequently are very defenseless against television advertising. The younger ones can't distinguish the advertising from the programs. And frequently they put more money in developing the television ads than they do in in the program. They usually have very high production value. I'm going to end here, but I think that what we need is a whole lot of education, that I think parents should not hesitate to early on teach their children about what advertising is, what it's trying to do, why they're trying to buy things, why they're trying to sell you something, so that the children become as sophisticated as possible and not abused and used and exploited by the people who want all of us to be consumers and materialistic. And the big advertisers are even targeting children, because children also decide what automobiles that some families buy, what kind of vans, what vacations, and so there's going to be a real focus gearing in. And finally, the Nielsen people, in fact, are right now studying, because they don't have good information on children watching TV, believe it or not. They don't have good information on it, and they're trying to figure out ways to collect it, because the advertisers want to know, because they want to target children for a lot of ads, not just related to toys, but related to products that adults buy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We turn now to Bill Cobbage. Bill.
Can you put that dull picture up? I want to segue from what Dr. Poussaint said about the dissolving of lines between commercial and other content to raise some questions. I don't have a lot of hard facts. I see some trends, and I have some questions that I'd like to raise about what kinds of public citizens we're creating with our media world now. If I were more confident of my ability to manipulate a computer, I would have done this live, so I could have clicked through this newspaper. This is the front page of Nando, Raleigh News and Observer, which is one of the most successful online traditional newspapers in the country. That's the first thing you see, and in effect, that's the front page of a serious regional newspaper. And if you see what's happened, the word is rapidly being diminished and replaced by symbols and icons. The word is disappearing out of the world of information, which young people who are going to be growing up on these databases rather than the regular newspaper, which introduces most of our citizens to public discourse. There is an argument now among some of the leading technological thinkers and manipulators that the image is eventually, in the relatively near future, in this atmosphere, in the world of images that you see on your computer screen, that the word is rapidly being replaced by images, because in fact the word is an artifact of an earlier age when you had to have words to symbolize images that you could not communicate otherwise. Now that we can transmit the image of a thing itself, you may no longer need words. I thought that was a relatively silly argument until I heard it pushed for about 15 minutes by a vice president for the Imagineering division of Disney, who is helping shape this technology. And one of the goals of at least this person and some of the people he works with is just that, to replace words completely with images. The kinds of images they're playing with are a 3D hologram of Tinkerbell, and the not the marketeers, the marketing people, are salivating over the potential for a 3D Tinkerbell to sweep through the screen and begin to lure or invite young viewers into the mall and begin to pitch goods with just a click away from a purchase. Now, this is occurring while the serious journalism that's trying to find a niche in this online world is desperate to find ways to make that world sustain their operations. It's very expensive to put a newspaper up on the web, so that the pressure is on everyone in the system, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, any major newspaper that's trying to create an online presence. The pressure is on everyone to find ways to make that operation a commercial success. And the kinds of suggestions that are being raised and the kinds of practices that are being tried out are practices that introduce into the body of normally news information, of a flow of news information, introduce into that flow of information a way to move to an advertised product or to move to a sale, to sell a product, to entice advertisers to the online newspaper by the guarantee that the reader of this information, news information, can be led directly to an advertisement or a purchase. There is, for example, a discussion at one newspaper, online newspaper now, by a company that wants to rent or sponsor, like that commercial was brought to you by the letter K, wants to sponsor a word that may appear in a news story, so that, for example, this is not the case, but this is a parallel case. Ford Motor would buy on this news organization's online paper, would buy the rights to the word Ford. And the word Ford would be hyperlinked, so that every time the word Ford appeared in a news story, there would be a link. And if you click on the link, it would take you first to the Ford advertisement before it took you to the story about Gerald Ford or the story about the Ford Theater. But the purchase of the word Ford is brought to you by Ford Motor Company in this body. Now, that hadn't happened yet, but those discussions have been turned down by at least two newspapers that I know of, so that pressure is on. You already see it on CNN's webpage, where you click on a menu item to go to sports, but before you go to sports, it takes you first to a commercial. You have no control over that. You go to that commercial, then you go to sports. In this atmosphere, I mean, if and it has not happened yet, but the pressure is very strong. If this is the atmosphere in which information about public life, stories about social events, public affairs, are so seamlessly wedded to commercial interest, to the need to sell a product while you're absorbing this information. If young people beginning at age 5 or 6, when they begin to work with these machines, if they're introduced to public discourse in that world, I'm curious in my own mind what sort of a 21-year-old what sort of a 21-year-old citizen comes out of that process. I have difficulty in my mind seeing the thought process, seeing how that leads to civic engagement, which is, after all, what we're concerned about with the supersaturated media atmosphere we've created. How do we use that system to impart information as well as sell goods and services? The troubling thing to me is the most recent, there was an article in Time magazine, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that touches on what you were saying, Dr. Poussin, about children. And Peg, we were talking earlier about, they now have a requirement of at least 3 hours of children's programming on each station each week. But because of the marketing success of so many of these children's programs, like Barney, which stimulated the sale of 44 million Barney dolls, there is a whole commercial apparatus now that sees a new opportunity here because children from 4 to 7 and 8 are now seen as the stimulants to purchases. They may not make the purchase themselves, but their activity and their excitement and their interest prods the purchase by the next older person in line in the household. So the pressure is on all parts of our media system to use the information package simply as a package to carry commercial messages and to motivate commercial activity, rather than a body of information useful to a citizen, surrounded by advertisements that help support both the economy and the information, but to embed in the information the motivation to purchase, to move, and to take part in another activity rather than civic engagement. I would just leave it there for now.
Well, thank you very much. We are joined by some special guest participants, and we want them to be participants. A group of high school students from City on a Hill School, led by their principal, Sarah Cass, and a group of students from Brookline High School, led by their principal, Bob Weintraub. We would like to give a representative of each of those two groups of high school students the first reaction, comment, question to what's been discussed up here on the panel. And from the City on the Hill School, Marie McGillicuddy, if you would rise, has been the brave volunteer, and I would like to get a volunteer, if I could, from an equally brave person from Brookline High School. Who's going to do it? And as you're...
Here he is, he'll do it.
Let's see, what's your name? Marco. What I would like Marco and Marie, as they gather their thoughts, comments, questions, we have one more set of video clips which Kiko Adato assembled. It's a juxtaposition between a video clip from a television program of the 1950s, the Mickey Mouse Club, and a television program of the 1990s, which I won't name, but it will be familiar enough, I fear. So we'll take a look at those video clips, and then we will turn to Marie and to Marco for comments, reactions. You could dim the lights and run the videos.
Have faith, Musketeers, and you will find it's true that faith can move mountains for you. Your faith is the real you, the strength that'll guide you. So always have faith, Musketeers.
Wonderful words to grow by. And now, let's join the Mouseketeers.
M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E, Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse. Forever let us
real soon. Why? Because we like you.
Unidentified official claimed that, quote, these parties were known for their wild, rowdy behavior, and any women in attendance should have expected that the men would tear their clothes off and cop a feel.
Okay, Bob, kind of makes me wish I'd joined the military.
Hey, Beavis. We should, like, throw a party.
Yeah. We could have, like, cake and stuff and
No, dumbass. We should have, like, a party with chicks. And, you know, cop a feel.
Yeah, that's a good idea, butthead. Where do you get these ideas?
They come from my wiener.
Oh, yeah.
We're gonna score.
Yeah.
Opinion, but I can first just start off with, since the children right now are exposed to a lot of things, and the parents are letting them be exposed to all of this, because I think most of the parents think, since they grew up, that they were sort of inclined to do work, and their parents were very strict on them, and they didn't have as much as we had, as much as we have right now. So when they were younger growing up, they probably had to go off and work because their families were very poor. And nowadays, parents think that they should let their children be open up to a lot more, meaning that they should let their children, like Little Miss Ramsey, I think that's disgusting. And those photos of showing their children naked, that's disgusting to me, because they're at a young age and they're being exposed to way too much, and the people that are letting them be exposed to that are their parents. And on their behalf, I'm trying to put myself in the parents' position, but I can't really find myself in their position, because the children, they're at too much of a young age, and they're inviting perverts to look at them, and they think that it's all right to let their children be exposed to, just because they want their children to be famous. They want their children to be in the spotlight. All they want is themselves in the spotlight, and their children are too young, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and they're posing naked. And then Calvin Klein ads, those are supposed to be gene ads, not sex invites. And to me, I think the media nowadays, it's just disgusting compared to what it was like back then. But that back then, children had to work to support their families, so the majority of them could not go to school and get an education. But nowadays, we have a lot of advantages, and we like to take advantage of those advantages. So that's my opinion.
Well done. Thank
you. As I listened to you, I completely agreed with what you all said. And as you were speaking, I was wondering what each and every single one of us can do. I see that we have isolated the problem, and we know where the problem lies. And I think lots of teenagers are aware of this problem. Just the other day, I was talking to a friend, and she said she didn't want to have any children because she didn't want to raise her children in this kind of world. Because I think that today's teenagers are aware of what is happening. I don't think they don't have the opinion that they're capable of handling all the things that we are bombarded with, and they're completely aware of what surrounds us, and they don't wish to raise children in such an environment. Another one of my friends wants to adopt children because she's aware that the world is overpopulated, and sometimes I think teenagers do not know how to handle all of the things that we're surrounded by, and we just cave in because I think deep down we're all very sensitive, and when we see all of the people around us supporting this idea that Calvin Klein and others are producing, we're inclined to do the same thing.
Thank you very much. There are microphones on either side of the room, and we'd like now to throw the discussion open to anyone who would like to raise a question or make a point or give a response to the points that our panelists have raised, or to respond to any of the images, the pictures, the commercials, the videos that you've seen. And I want to emphasize, too, that the high school students from City on a Hill and from Brookline are also welcome to join in, to continue joining in the discussion.
My name is Dr. Franklin Nussbaum. I continue to find that while we're a most informed society in the world, probably, we're dying of ignorance. And I would like to sense from this group of panelists a passion that not only are you here to inform, but you have to join in a coalition to really motivate people. Tell them how bad the disease is. I don't sense that. I attend classes, throughout, but we have very informed people who are leading discussions, but I get none of that feeling of imagination, motivation, and unless we have that from the people who are recognizing the condition, there's no reason why you should expect the public to be responding.
Good. Thank you. Over here. Go ahead.
Did you want to respond
Go
to
ahead.
that, any of you?
Well, maybe we'll take a few comments and then we'll put it back to the panel. Go ahead.
Thanks for that comment. I liked it. The forum is entitled Sex, Commercialism, and the Disappearance of Childhood. I'm wondering what the explanation is for what seems to me to be the most obvious example of egregious human rights violations related to the title of the forum. And the one I can think of is child prostitution and more generally child labor, particularly in Southeast Asia right now, and what the United States is doing about that generally. And it's child labor also going on in Los Angeles, in factories that major corporations that advertise to children, such as Nike, perpetuate. It's an international issue as well as a domestic one.
Good. Let's see if would someone on the panel like to address the issue of child labor, child prostitution as other egregious examples of the disappearance of childhood or the victimization of childhood, Dr. Poussin?
Yeah, I think, obviously they are, and they should be on a table. I think we had kind of not a narrow scope, but a limited scope in terms of what we were going to address tonight. But I think all of those issues, the exploitation of children, child labor, which is becoming an issue in the United States, and there are many groups involved in a very activist way in trying to do something about this. In fact, just finally getting to Nike to acknowledge that they're exploiting, and all of the corporations who are exploiting that we don't know anything about and don't have information about. And I think that, again, takes a lot of activism and organizations to try to pinpoint where the issues and problems are. I think, too, the selling off of children into prostitution, which is going on all around the world. I think we have to be concerned about children, not just here in the United States, but also internationally. And there are many, worse things, in fact, going on with children internationally, including dying and starvation from hunger, than is not happening in the same way in the United States. So I think your point is very well taken.
Ecuador?
Just to address your point about Nike and the media, one of the initiatives that we're taking in children's studies is to really seriously look at how kids in schools are educated about the media. And there's a lot of work being done, and it's good work, about how can children's issues be better covered by the press and by the media. But what we want to address is a more formative concern in terms of the development of a readership, critical and reflective for a democratic society. And the example of Nike is perfect. How can you get children to read the media, you know, the ads, and Nike is a good example. How could you take children in the schools and make them more reflective about the images that they see? Now, you could take Nike, and this addresses your point too, as a case study, in the schools in a program that was trying to cultivate a democratic readership. That might be a case study. Nike ads and Nike shoes. Michael tells a story of our two boys who are 9 and 11 at Runkle School in Brookline, a public school in Brookline, and he glanced when he was watching one of the basketball teams at the kids, at their shoes. Every kid had Nike shoes. And then he learned from the gym teacher that he thought, hey, you know how you're trying to separate the kids to play a game in gym? He said, I thought I'd separate them by sneaker brands. But there was a problem. They were all wearing Nike shoes. He couldn't say Reebok, Nike, whatever.
Do you think it would be a more active, I mean, media education, media literacy is crucial. Also, a crucial component in that pursuit being organizing against the way that corporations and corporate power and wealthy interests are generally dominating the whole media spectacle.
Well,
Isn't
here,
that also
looking at the case
necessary?
just to finish, on Nike, to see, to relate it to children's lives, is you'd have a case study, Nike ads and Nike shoes. How are Nike shoes, this would be this readership course, how are Nike shoes produced? Who makes Nike shoes? And where do they make them? And you could integrate these child, sweatshops and labor shops and point out to the kids, that's where your wonderful shoes are coming from. You open up the children to the whole world, to political and social issues that are revolved around the content of what's happening producing the shoe, instead of simply saying, well, let's look at ads and how they manipulate people. You get right into
Nike's already done that.
Okay, I want to turn, Bill Kovich has a point on that, and then I will move over to other questioners.
Yeah,
Bill?
I'd just like to pick up on what she was saying and take it a step further. It's not just reading ads, it's reading the media generally. Right. One of the things we're concerned about and we've talked about is that we have entire courses that run all the way through college and even into graduate school to teach people how to read works of fiction. But we have no course, anywhere that I'm aware of, no sustained course to teach young people how to read the most important book in their lives, the daily press. Not just the ads, but the information that's going to tell them about the world they live in and how they can engage in that world. That means a media literacy training both for reading content and for reading ads, because the two are tied together. If you see the Nike ads, the natural question is, where are the stories that tell me about those Nike sneakers and how they're made? Where are they? Why are they? They're made here too, not just overseas. So I mean, it's that critical reading of the media is one of the points we want to engage in. And Mr. Nussbaum, I'm part of a movement of concerned journalists. We've got over 500 journalists now who have signed on, and we're holding forums all around the country talking about the responsibility of journalists, owners and practitioners, to the public rather than just their business arrangements.
And Ross, I just wanted to mention on this course, it isn't you want Nike to be teaching you about Nike shoes, or Time Magazine going into the schools teaching kids about how to read public affairs magazine. You want educators who are not partisans for a particular product teaching that, and that's what we're trying to work on in this new initiative, to work on a school curriculum eventually with educators to make, as Bill said, the greatest book that you should read in terms of being informed by public affairs, the variety of the media, to make us critical and reflective readers of that.
Good. And I should have asked people to identify themselves, please, as they ask their questions.
My name is Dan Winton from the Kennedy School. Good evening. Let me propose a story about a young child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who loves to fly, and with the encouragement of his or her parents, decides to attempt to become the youngest person to fly across the country. This child leaves the West Coast and many days later lands on the East Coast safely and successfully with, to what I suspect, much public fanfare. and media glorification about the achievements of children, and possibly even a call from President Clinton for congratulations. Many of us know that this story doesn't end that way, and this child, I believe, died somewhere in Montana or Wyoming. And I wonder, what do you make of these seemingly different reactions to a child's attempt to do something that what many of us would consider adult?
So you see this as another kind of example that gained great cultural notoriety of the blurring of the distinction between adulthood and childhood. Let's take that as another illustration of these themes and let some other people pose questions and then go back to our panel. Yes?
Okay, thank you. My name is Katie Murphy. I'm an undergraduate at Harvard. We've obviously seen a very striking example tonight of just what a drastic change has been from the 50s to the 90s, just how far the line has been pushed during all this time. But now that we are here, do you think that we can go back? And even if we can go back to that ideal time of the 50s, should we go back? Is there an answer to this question?
And are we holding up the 50s as an ideal time, or are we being nostalgic by comparing the 50s? After all, who wants to watch the Mickey Mouse Club today? Does any of our panelists want to take on that question?
I think it's a great question.
Yeah, it's.
I thought you were going to say that you thought that was a great show.
No, well, I did, but I think it's a great question, and my answer is no. We can't go back, and we can't go back on any of these things. I think what we're trying to do is to understand what's happening and try to figure out how we work with the world as it is and try to make it more useful to a self-governing community. I think that's that's my interest in this. But I don't see, you can't go back.
Is there a way of undoing the loss of innocence?
Also, I think that so much happens so rapidly that the educational system, including the parents' education of the children, really hasn't kept pace with what's going on and the impact of it. Most parents don't know that it's harmful for children to watch 4 hours of television a day and not go out to play and interact with each other. So the average number of hours a child watches television is about 3 to 4 a day in the United States, with parents accepting that as okay. But if they were educated as to the negative impact, including the ones on health and inactivity and becoming overweight and obese and so on, that perhaps they would act. I think, too, we have a serious problem, Bill, because I wonder, even with educational programs in the schools or whatever, can we ever really mount the kind of campaign that advertisers can mount against you? That is, can we ever match what Nike does in an advertisement? Can we match what the two biggest advertisers on TV do? That's McDonald's and Burger King, and getting people to eat Big Macs and Whoppers by any kind of educational campaign? I mean, I really have serious question of whether we can do that, or I feel that we should attempt it. But so far, there's no avenue for doing that, and it's not like trying to stop people from smoking, but the impact of the advertising from the fast food places are making a lot of children obese. They're getting type 2 diabetes. And what kind of educational campaign could we possibly mount?
I think the smoking example is the perfect one. I mean, that was a matter of public education. That was a matter of very slowly educating people to read the media, to read Joe Camel ads, to read the media more critically and more intelligently. I don't think it's so much a matter of overwhelming the ability of advertisers to advertise, because our world is built on that, but simply to educate a generation of people who read those things critically and make their own decision. They're going to decide whether they're going to eat a Big Mac or not. But I think the decision is made thoughtfully and not by instinct, and I think that's the only progress we can hope for, and I think maybe in an open and free society, that's the only progress we can really count on.
Professor Martha Minow.
I've been trying to think about how to rationally respond to what has been a very visceral evening for me. And I'm trying to catalog what are the actual action steps that the panel is implying. And it sounds as though there are 3, maybe more, but tell me if I'm missing any, and then I have some questions about them. They are public education for parents and for young people so that they become critical readers of these events. Trying to develop laws, perhaps, though everyone's queasy about them. Maybe, for example, Dr. Bussant talks about changing the rating system or setting restrictions at the outside of what age child can see R-rated movies. Trying to mobilize public boycotts, perhaps. I mean, here Kiku's descriptions of what made Calvin Klein pull the ads seems relevant. What's striking to me, maybe I'm missing something, but about all of these, is that they are calling for forms of restraint by individuals. And I'm not sure if that's a message that sells, if you can excuse the expression today. Self-restraint. It sells to some people like that a lot, but I don't see it as a winning strategy. What is the affirmative vision on the side of the good and the true? If it's not turning back to the 50s, what is the affirmative vision that's not just limit ourselves, just say no, learn how to boycott? What is the positive? And just one more point here. To juxtapose the image of childhood innocence is very powerful, but of course, children have never been all innocent or all sexual or anything. Children are constructed. The images we have of children are always constructed by adults, and we have as vital and long-standing traditions of viewing children as savage and dangerous and yes, seductive as we do about innocence. So with the understanding that there's no necessary reality about what a child is, it is about cultural production, I'm just wondering what is the affirmative vision we could be constructing rather than just self-restraint?
Well, just one point of disagreement with Martha. I think that it isn't true, just on the last point, that it's always been the same. Yes, these are social and cultural constructions, but what I was trying to show in my talk, they really have changed, that it's really eroded the ideals of childhood innocence, that the constructions we shared for a whole 100 and more years in our culture, and I'm talking about these ideals which are important to preserve. In other words, it's important that our ideals still stand there, even if they don't match with the reality, that we have these values and ideals in the culture, and that the eroding of the ideals is a problem. And it's tied in with portrait photography. We know when we take a photograph, a portrait photograph or a beautiful snapshot of a family member, that's not all that they are. It's not them at their worst moment, or all the, negative sides or problematic sides, but yet to have an ideal and to sustain and believe in that ideal is important in terms of aspiring to who we should become. So I think it's important to see the ideals as an important, aspiration, and that the values and beliefs that we have in our society are important to sustain, not just in the media, but to sustain in our families, in our community groups, in our schools, and in our communities of religious faith. And when I talk about at least an affirmative solution, in each of these spheres, you can see how important it is that these fundamental institutions of our society, like the family, be strengthened. For example, on reading together with kids, and there are lots of people encouraging that. A child who in their home is read to by their parents, and books are alive and an engaging part of their existence. When you're little, you're read to as a baby and as a toddler, and later you read and discuss books together. That is a home resilient to TV. Okay, so you watch junk and you cool out to TV. How many of us haven't, as a kid on Saturday morning, just watched tons of cartoons, or a family that eats well and eats together, both nutritionally good food, but shares meals together? Okay, if you eat junk food, once in a while, because the junk food you're resilient. It doesn't have the effect as if that's all you're living on. And it's the same thing with restoring, and it shouldn't just be the proposition of conservatives and the right wing when they talk about restoring religion and faith and community and the family. That should be something that liberals and progressives are talking about too, restoring these basic institutions. And we see in City on the Hill a school which is vibrant, not in just educating but in restoring and giving people a sense of civic engagement. So when we think of the criticisms of the media, I don't see it as we have to operate within the realm of the media. And I see that's the problem with these so-called media literacy courses. When Bill and I are talking about establishing a curriculum for a democratic readership, it's not to be parasitic on the media, just watch a whole bunch of TV and say what's wrong with it. It's to restore reading, as he said, and to see reading the newspaper as an important book in your life. If you read the newspaper and read history, you're in a good position as a citizen. So I see going back to these basic institutions as part of the progressive agenda, and not just the conservative agenda, as a fundamental part of our answer to the problems we've shown tonight.
We could go on for a very long time, but I feel a responsibility to this group of high school students who have to go home and do homework before we finish. And so the same may also be true of a very few of the Harvard undergraduates who may be in the audience. What I've heard listening to our panel and to the discussion that they have provoked is that there is a kind of tug of war going on in American society, a tug of war between those who would recruit young people as consumers and those who would recruit young people as citizens. Now, of course, children and young people and teenagers and students have always been, in some measure, both consumers and citizens. But a lot of what we've seen tonight and heard from our panelists is that the tendency in American society to view and to treat children as consumers is gaining a certain kind of momentum and strength and upper hand over those resources in our society that would view and treat young people as citizens. Those are two very different callings, two very different identities, because consumers are invited to satisfy their wants and desires, whereas citizens are invited to reflect on their desires and to critically reflect on them and to engage the desires but also the ideals of the people among whom they live. So we haven't been able to lay out for you a recipe for the successful completion of this tug of war on the side of citizenship against the pull of consumption, but I think our panelists have done a remarkable job in describing the tug of war that is at work in American society today on the battlefield or in the arena of childhood. And I want to thank them very much and thank all of you for joining us.
Yeah.
Susan?
Kennedy's, Professor Kennedy.